Did you get that last part? Wait, listen to that last part because that is the identifying. It's a country song. They're syllables, by the way.
I've always thought this game is absurd. I'm still not
Dude.
Joking.
Oh.
It's wagon wheel.
Oh my gosh.
What is up, guys? We're back with the Encounter Podcast. I'm Sam. That's Ethan. This is our friend Carter, who's trying to very quietly take a sip because Carter, no, just give him a little. He put ice in his drink, and so now it's so noisy. But we're in the basement today because there's 3 of us, and
It's cold outside too.
it's cold outside. So just thought it'd be more cozy. All right, Carter, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I went to high school with both of you.
I thought you were going to stop at I went to high school.
I am in my 3rd year at Washburn University. Did like an accelerated program they have, so I'll start law school in the fall. I'm a Spanish major right now, so love to do something in immigration law or I don't know, like investigation, something like that. That's about it. I got 2 older siblings. I'm a youngest.
Lit.
They're both successful.
Dude, that means we have
parents.
one of each. Oldest,
Oh.
middle, youngest.
Yeah, that's
in
true.
order.
In
Wow.
order
Wow,
or
that's-
reverse order.
But then in reverse order of age. As of
Yes.
us 3,
Oh,
I
that
am the
actually
oldest.
is crazy.
You're the middle, and you're the youngest.
That's crazy. Yeah, that is
That's
I'm
wild,
in the
actually.
middle.
Yeah, that's fun. Yeah, I obviously grew up. You guys knew me growing up, so grew up in the church, and then really struggled with doubt of wanting to believe in God, but not being able to convince myself that He was that He existed. And I tried to kind of mediate that with a lot of apologetics and a lot of studying. And I thought if I could just know enough, then I would have faith. But ultimately, it came down to a conversation with you and Matthew Will talking about your personal testimonies and the relationship you have with God. And you asked me, do I read my Bible consistently? And I was like, well, I do for school, but, not really beyond that. And so I started reading the Bible for myself. And that's when I came to know God, as a person beyond, just an idea. God was a good idea. He seemed to fit. He seemed to fit into a worldview of thinking where you're we have a really ordered earth, so God can help answer that. But he was just an idea to solve a problem, not a person in my life. So, but now, it's pretty amazing to have that relationship once you embark on it and to really see him start to work in you when you start to open doors. So yeah, I do a lot of the same ministry stuff you guys do. So yeah.
Yeah.
Come on.
I didn't actually know that part about. I guess I didn't know that part about
What part?
Matthew
Oh,
and I.
is
Yeah,
it Doc Sazo?
Well, shout out Doc Salsa Ministries too.
Yeah.
I didn't know. That's really cool, actually.
So,
That goes into exactly what we were talking about the other day, where the two ends of the spectrums that people or churches will harp on. There's a concept and the
Yeah.
idea, and there's knowing about God and His Scripture, and then there's the the relational side and knowing Him as a person and as a being and who He is in your life.
right.
And like you said, without the union of both,
Right.
it's kind of hard to have. It's hard to have genuine faith.
Yeah. Or something that really does bring there's a security and understanding and learning and getting past spiritual milk.
Yeah.
But there's also a security in knowing God personally, and yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, 'cause you definitely have to have both in order to continue to grow.
Yeah.
You can quickly become spiritually stagnant if you harp on either side of those
Right.
spectrums. Yeah. All right. So today the scripture we're covering is exactly where we picked up, or exactly where we left off last episode. So this will be Galatians 1:11 through 24. So
11 to start. We don't know how far we'll get.
yeah.
I had YouVersion playing in the car on the way here.
Hey, shout out the Bible app.
Yeah, you pulled up and I heard someone talking.
That was actually you. I pulled up listening to last week's podcast.
Oh.
If you're somebody who doesn't have a Bible, shout out the YouVersion app, founded by Craig Rochelle, also the founder of Life Church.
Did you know that he actually didn't found that?
Found the Bible app?
Mm-mm.
Did his church?
It was somebody he knows, but
I want to hear from Craig's mouth. I wholeheartedly believe that Craig founded the Bible
he's
app.
also been to Craig Rochelle's house because he's friends with his sons. So
That's pretty cool, though.
I would assume that he probably knows. But
But all that to say,
anyways, you want to read 11? Oh, by the way, Ethan doesn't read here.
Oh, okay.
So,
just like high school.
yeah.
Throwback to
doesn't-
West Civ with Dr. DeWalt, bro. I swear, every time he called on me, I became illiterate. Every time he called on me. No, but
11 to 17.
Yeah.
Sweet.
All right. For I would have known, brothers, that the gospel that was preached by me is not man's gospel. For I did not receive it from any man, nor was I taught it, but I received it through a revelation of Jesus Christ. For you have heard of my former life in Judaism, how I persecuted the church of God violently and tried to destroy it. And I was advancing in Judaism beyond many of my own age among the people. So extremely zealous was I for the traditions of my fathers. But when he who had set me apart before I was born, and who had called me in his grace, was pleased to reveal his Son to me, in order that I might preach him among the Gentiles, I did not immediately consult with anyone, nor did I go to Jerusalem to those who were apostles before me, but I went away into Arabia, and returned again to Damascus.
Just to start, I was actually rereading through this today, and this stuck out to me. It's funny that like different things stick out different times, but how it says the gospel preached to me is not man's gospel, and I was like, oh yeah, like it calls us to die to ourselves, and it calls us to wow, I got so confused. Oh, okay. Yeah. It calls us to die to ourselves, and then it calls us to like recognize our own inability, and our own weakness. And it's funny because like the power of the gospel and the power of Jesus is useless to you until you come to the end of yourself. And then when you understand that you have nothing, then that's where it starts to work, and that's where like you were, well, I don't know that that's what you were talking about, but like this whole thing with like, oh, I need to be doing these things, and it can just so easily be turned into something that's like based off of my ability to comply or my ability to do these things. Well, then Jesus loses his power because we're not relying on him, we're relying on ourselves. And so
yeah, I think it's interesting how he connects that concept in verse 12 and verse 13, talking about basically his testimony. I like that he harps on, the gospel that I preach, it's not from man. He says, for I did not receive it from man, nor was I taught it, but I received it through a revelation of Jesus Christ. So I like that he harps on that the gospel isn't something that he learned because he was a Pharisee. He was a Pharisee, so he knew all the old law, right? But he learns the gospel not through teachings, but through an interaction and through like an encounter with Jesus, which I think is really cool because I think that's his whole point of going so hard here in 11 through 24 is he really wants to clarify that. We see it later. He talks about he didn't go and talk to any other disciples to learn the gospel. He's like, I am so changed, not because of the logical reasoning aspect of the gospel, but because of his personal interaction that he had with Jesus on the road to Damascus,
Yeah.
And so it goes right into that. Like he realizes that who he was before before the interaction with Jesus, his former life, he persecuted, persecuted the church, just like he says. But after he had the interaction, he understands, dude, it's not me. Like it's not who I am and what I've learned, but it's Jesus who had the power to change me.
And I think that that's something, which this is your favorite verse in the Bible, but I always go back to it, 2 Corinthians 12:9, where it's like, for he said to me,
My grace is sufficient for you.
Yes, my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I'll boast all the more gladly of my weakness. And it's Paul right here, like, not boasting, but boasting. Like, he's basically telling who he was. And he's like, I was horrible,
Yeah.
And it's like he doesn't hide that because he sees that not as something to be ashamed of, but something to, like, show the glory of God.
Yeah.
And so I just think that's super cool because that's also so humble. It's like, it doesn't, like, I don't care what you think about me because this isn't about me,
Yeah.
and it shows the Lord. And it's like, wow.
I think it's cool. Paul sometimes in his letters feels the need, like he has to build his credibility because he's not one of the original apostles. But he always, like, the only time that he talks about himself, right, is to ensure that people know where he's coming from, right? He's not building his credibility for his own sake. He's always building his credibility for the sake of sharing the gospel.
Yeah.
But I was wondering, like, why is he saying, like, why does he feel the need to say, I didn't talk to anyone? But it's because he's saying, hey, I knew the gospel directly from Jesus. I didn't I didn't hear it from a man. And that really strikes me now reading it because I was wondering, like, what does that mean?
Yeah.
I think it goes, he talks about it later in in chapter 2. So I want us to get there, but I think that I think it goes super well together because then he talks about going to the disciples his first time.
Mm-hmm.
And so we'll get there when we get there though. So.
Yeah, I think, Carter, what you were talking about, or I don't know, one of you was talking about it, verse 13 there where he talks about his, like, who he was. I think that's just I think he sets a great example of talking about his past failures. Because I think, at least in my mind, how I view it now is like, that's who I used to be. Like, that's who I was. Like, I was dirty, like, I was that bad person. I don't really want to talk about that because Jesus has changed me. So why would I even tell other people about that if that's not who I am now? And I think that in myself, that stems just from a spirit of pride and me when I think that I made the change in my life from who I was then to who I am now. I don't want to tell people who I was. But I think it is so beautiful how Paul has no shame in talking about who he was. And I think it is because he fully and truly understands and wants to get the message across that he could never have changed himself from being somebody who, he says violently and tried to destroy it. He was somebody who was so zealous and extreme. He literally says, so extremely zealous for that tradition that he realizes I could never have changed myself from who I was then to who I am now. And I think it's just a really good example of how we can show Christ's changing power in our own lives through our own personal testimony in that aspect.
I think that the extremely zealous part kind of goes back to what we talked about last week with, like, just because someone's passionate about something doesn't mean it's true. Because Paul was so passionate about the traditions that he was having people killed. And then you see him completely changed. And it's like, it's got to align with the Bible,
Yeah.
I think the reference of, like, his life in Judaism, it's pretty applicable today. I feel like I run into a lot of people who will say, like, well, other people are really zealous for their faith too. Because one of the main ways we, like, talk about Christianity or share it is through our testimony because we're excited about what and the response was like, well, other people are zealous for their faith too. And so Paul is likewise, like, admitting, like, hey, I was on fire for something else, Yeah. And it reminds me of, I wish I had names and stuff ready, but there's a guy who did for a long, I think he's still going on, but did basically a ministry in, like, impossible to reach, like, Taliban controlled areas through, like, television, like, antennas. They got satellites basically to try to, because it's just impossible to go in there, right? But he had established a group of small pastors, and they took a trip outside of the country and then had, like, a little, like, mini seminary to learn. And at the end of the last night, they were all singing and dancing together, and he was like, they just don't know what's coming. So he brought them all in, and he was like, hey guys, like, I mean, you just need to know, like, I mean, I know you're excited, but like you
Mm.
could be going to your deaths. And they were like, listen, we were ready to die for God that didn't love us before.
Mm.
How much more are we willing to die for a God who does love us? And that really strikes me here too with Paul, that he was ready to die for Yahweh when he knew him without not as Jesus as well. But now, like, how much more is he willing after he's seeing the amazing work of his Messiah, like on the cross and saving him?
Wow, that's good.
We'll put that podcast in the link. There's a podcast on Apple Podcasts that does testimonies, and that guy's on there. The episode is called it's like From Death to America to Jesus is King or something like that, because that's the guy's story. He was in, I forget if it was Iran or Afghanistan, but he was chanting "Death to America" or something.
Oh wow.
Yeah.
No, but just like you said, 16, it says he was pleased to reveal his son.
Mm.
And I just think that's so cool, because it's like we have a God of revelation.
Yeah.
And we have a God who wants to be known by his people. And we see these people so zealous for a God that literally does nothing for them. It's just the fact that he's God, and that he's, the idea of creator and almighty. But we know God is those things, like has those attributes, but he also loves and cares for us. And so it's like, how much more passionate should we be? Like, we shouldn't let people who serve a false God serve their God more faithfully than we serve the real God.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that goes back to like the idea of a sense of divinity. Like each human inside of them has the desire to serve a higher power, and this is why we see so many religions show up across the world. But like, yeah, we're ready to praise God just because he is God. Like, that's how we're designed. But how much more to praise a God who wants to be involved in our lives
for what he's done too.
Yeah.
That's so crazy.
Yeah.
Yeah. For verses 15 and 16, I'm just going to read them again. It says, "But when he who set me apart before I was born, and who called me by his grace, was pleased to reveal his son to me in order that I might preach among the Gentiles." And it's just cool because it shows God doing all the work and then our response, right? So first he sets us apart before we're born. Then he calls us by his grace, and then he reveals his son to us. And then the response we have is we go for his glory. And I don't know, I just think it's cool because going back to like what we were talking about earlier, we did none of that. It wasn't us who made that progress or who earned the favor of God. It's him who freely gave it. And actually, I was just listening to a song on the way here, but it talks about how Jesus is God's offering, and that is just like the craziest thought, that like God made an offering for peace between himself and man. I don't know. So it's all God.
Yeah.
We didn't do anything. But now we can, which is cool.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then that next section is like how Paul responds.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I think just like a personal like note for verses 15 and 16, what's really cool to me is the way that Paul lays this all out, but especially verse 16 here, the end of 15. He called me by his grace and was pleased to reveal the Son to me in order, ... So I just think it's cool that Paul understands that Jesus was revealed to him in the perfect timing that God wanted it to happen. And I think just on like a more personal note for me is like, you know, sometimes there's places in our lives that we want to grow, or we have an expectation that we will be better in this area of our walk with the Lord by this time in our life. And you arrive at that time and you're like, man, I'm not where I thought I would be. But Paul had to hold the coats when Stephen was stoned.
Yeah.
Paul had to be extremely zealous and religious against the church and against Jesus and everything that was happening at that time in order for the testimony that he has now to be possible.
Mm-hmm.
So I think just for myself personally, reading through this passage was a really good reminder of that, you know, the Lord has us on our own personal walks where we're at for a reason.
Yeah.
And he gives us those desires to be better, obviously, because he wants us to put in the work towards that, but to not become discouraged if we're not where we think that we should be, or we're not where those around us are. Like, don't become discouraged in that, but use it as don't use comparison as a fuel, but use trusting the Lord and his timing of his plan kind of as something to fall back on. And remember that, you know, I'm struggling through this the way I am, or I'm not where I want to be as deep spiritually as I want for a reason. And, you know, ultimately that's to glorify the Lord.
Yeah. What would you
Yeah.
say? Oh, sorry. What would you say to someone who feels stuck?
Stuck in, like, not... just stuck in any
Like
aspect of their
Spiritual
life.
walk. Like, they're just wondering, why would God not want me to go faster?
I don't know where it talks about this. I think it may be in... I think it's in John, where we were reading the other night. We were in John 8, right? For
Mm-hmm.
our Bible study. There's the story about the man who... Jesus healing the blind man, right?
Yeah.
Let me get to it. This is what verse 11 says. So John 8:11, it says, this is the blind man talking when the Pharisees question him. It says, he answered, the man called Jesus made mud and anointed my eyes and said to me, go to Siloam and wash. So I went and washed and received my sight. And this progression of how this man is healed was really beautiful to me, because I think it's very much twofold. I think that the Lord can completely make us where he wants us to be in our spiritual walks right now.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that there is so much more value in us walking with him hand in hand to get to where he wants us to be. Because right here, it's like Jesus could have just healed that guy and his sight and just kept on walking.
Yeah.
You know? But Jesus spits in the dirt, makes the mud, puts it on his eyes,
Yeah.
and then commands him to say, hey, I want you to take that step of faith. I want you to put effort into this relationship if you really want it. Put effort into you returning your sight. And I need you to go wash at the pool. Yeah. And that is what will bring your healing.
Yeah.
And so I guess to that person that's struggling, just a good reminder is, you know, it's not all one-sided from us or from God. There is that twofold. You know, he changes our hearts and he gives us those desires that are for him. But we also have to be putting in, you know, you have to do some of the legwork. I mean, and it can't be just one or the other. But so I guess I would just encourage with that, you know, stay consistent, stay faithful where you're at. And I believe that the Lord will, if the desires of your heart are for him and to grow closer to him and be more like him, and you are taking those steps to pursue him, you know, reading your word, praying, you know, trying to turn away from sin and pursue him above that, I believe that he will, you know, draw near to him and he'll draw near to you.
Yeah.
So, I don't know. That story in John 8 is just really cool to me. I guess it's John 9 at that point. John 9:11. Oh, no.
Well, assuming all of that's there, about just on that idea of like doing, like consistently staying and pursuing when you feel like God isn't moving, like when you feel stuck. I look back for like several years, I was praying like, Lord, like I don't want to doubt anymore. Like I want to be confident in my salvation. Your word tells me that if I have the Holy Spirit, like it's like the sign and the seal of salvation, that I should be confident, that I should know that I'm saved. And I remember doubting God, his existence, and even just as like freshman year of college, freshman to sophomore year. So not even like long ago. But I remember just praying like, Lord, I still feel like I'm in the same place, but kind of like Jacob wrestling with God, like I am not letting go. Like I know that you're what's good. So I'm just telling you right now, God, like I'm not giving up. Like you know what, like take whatever time you need. I'm not quitting. Like it's kind of like this. It was almost like out of frustration a little bit, right? But I think it was really valuable to my faith of just like, I'm not giving up on what's best. Like I'm not going to move on. Yeah, I'm going to stay here, Lord, until you give me what you've promised me. And which sounds, I think, kind of like
that's
demandy, but like that, he has promised it and he's going to come through. So yeah.
And I think also that part of it has to do with just like depending on God. Because if God takes away everything, then it's super easy to become self-sufficient. Not actually self-sufficient, but to stop relying on him. Whereas, like, there's going to be times where you still struggle with temptation, you still doubt, you still, want to remember things that you've forgiven people for. And it's like, you have to turn to him in those moments, in every single moment of every single day, and rely on him to take those things. Because if he just did it once and bam, it's gone, like, that's a testimony. But also, there's so much beauty in, I constantly have to be looking at you, or I'm weak again.
Yeah.
Yeah,
there's definitely beauty in both of those testimonies where it's like, man, one night, I was this guy ready to take my life, and the next day, like, the Lord changed who I am, and, I have this zeal for him and for the life that he's given me. But then there's other testimonies that it's just like, nose to the grindstone, where you feel like you're just continuing to struggle with these things, and you want them to change, but it takes longer than you want. But it does come from that. Both of those are rooted in fully relying on the Lord and fully, changing in who he wants you to be in his time.
And back to your point about waiting, like, I'm just going to wait here, like, that shows the Lord where your priorities are. Because it's really easy to say, Lord, I want this, for 2 minutes to just say a prayer like, God, I want you to change me like this. But when it's, God, I am going to stay here until your promise is fulfilled, then that's, one, remembering the faithfulness of God. And then 2, showing him, like, I have nowhere else to go. It has to be you.
Yeah, like when we say stay here, it doesn't mean just like I'm going to stay in this phase of my life. Like, it means I'm going to stay here, like, I am going to keep in the scripture. I'm going to keep praying. I'm going to keep pursuing you. I'm going to keep doing your work, like, until, forever, until I can't. Because I have nowhere else to go.
Yeah.
Do we read the next section?
Yeah. We all good?
Yeah.
Okay. I'll read.
Oh, let me read.
Whoa.
Let me read.
Are you sure?
I'm positive.
Okay, you must have been studying up, I guess.
Yeah, I was memorizing it while we were talking, so.
Listen to a recording like 30 times.
I figured it's the smallest section we're going to come to, so I might as well take the opportunity while I have it. No, we're chilling. So verse 18. Then after 3 years, I went up to Jerusalem to visit Cephas and remained with him 15 days. But I saw none of the other apostles except James, the Lord's brother. In what I am writing to you before God, I do not lie. Then I went into the region of Syria and Cilicia. That sounds good. And I was still unknown in person to the churches of Judea that are in Christ. They only were hearing it said, "He who used to persecute us is now preaching the faith he once tried to destroy." And they glorified God because of me.
And they glorified God because of me is crazy. Like, I want that to be said of me, And that's not like a prideful statement from Paul.
Yeah.
Like, he's saying they glorified God because of my weakness and his strength shown in that weakness. because where my weakness is shown, then it just widens the gap between God and I.
Cephas is Peter, by the way, if anybody's wondering. Not that you guys were, but.
Good. I like that.
That was smart. What was he doing for 3 years?
Literally just like being taught by Jesus, right?
I'm not sure. Is that like the
That's what I think.
church theological opinion? Yeah. Is that, I've heard that that's why pastors go to seminary for 3 years. But
I have no idea.
I mean, I have no
Was
clue.
that a joke or was
No,
that for
I've-
real?
that's
Is that,
what
so for
someone
real? Is that how long seminary is?
someone told me that.
I
I
don't
thought
know.
seminary was a master's of 3 years.
Should we call Grant right now and ask him? I have no clue.
I have no
Yeah, I
idea
don't know
either.
They probably have an accelerated program now.
Yeah.
I like that he continues to harp on this message that he wants to get across. Like, the gospel isn't from somebody else.
Mm-hmm.
I like how he's just like, I don't lie. In what I'm writing to you before God, I do not lie. He's still always like, he just wants so badly that people would believe, like they would turn and understand. He's trying to make himself like, and again, that's the reason he tries to make himself credible.
Mm-hmm. Also, I think that Paul's testimony is just like, I don't know. Basically, you can't read the Bible and say you're too far gone for God
Yeah.
with Paul, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'll use that actually. Like, people have been like, nah, dude, like, I'm going to hell for sure. And it was like, have you hunted down at a specific religion, actually Christians, and tried to murder them? And they're like, no. And I'm like, you can probably make it.
Yeah.
Oh man.
You could shoot me right now. And
You're still making it, pal.
I'm reading this book by Lee Strobel, who wrote Case for Christ, but this one's called Is God Real, I think. It's his newest book. He kind of updated all the information he's been in the past, and one of the chapters is just a list of testimonies, testifying, like, is God real, And one of them really shocked me. It was Evel Knievel, which I don't know if you guys knew this, but in like the last year of Evel Knievel's life, I mean, and this guy's life was like sex, drugs, and women, and jumping motorcycles, of course. But
We have the museum in Topeka.
yeah,
Yeah.
Evel Knievel, come to Topeka. That's why people come to Topeka. That, and if they are just really in big trouble and have to go to court,
Yeah.
at the Capitol. But in the last year of his life, he became a Christian, I think through a dream, but now I'm forgetting. No. Yeah, he was sitting on a beach in Florida and like had basically heard God.
Wow.
And when he got baptized, like, gave a speech, and hundreds of people were saved. And then he died a year later. And it's just
That's
like,
crazy.
like, Paul is trying to use his testimony to say, like, this is crazy that this kind of change would happen. And this one's thousands of years old, but even so, like, we have extra biblical sources that talk about Paul. Like, even atheist historians will generally agree. Like, there was a guy named Paul who was persecuting Christians, and he was a Jew, and he switched and became a Christian and went on missionary journeys. But just that testimony, the power of a testimony in the Christian faith, I think, is really cool. So I see this a lot. Like, Paul had to work through what he had done in order to go out and preach about it, to go out, come out and say this, know? And like, there are those of you out there, and there are friends that I have who are recently saved, or and they're still trying to work through something. And I guess my encouragement would just be like, hey, bring that to God, keep coming back to him, because he is going to do amazing things. And you can get to the point where you can stand up and say, man, I was sexually abused as a kid. This happened. I was doing this, and God is going to use it. And even though that seems impossible right now, like, he wants you at that point, and you didn't endure that for nothing. You endured it so that he could be glorified even more.
Yeah.
Yeah, that is a super good point. Because I think a lot of the times, even like in like my own life with just like, emotions I have. And it's not necessarily like keeping me from salvation per se, like not keeping me from going to God, but it's like, it's just easier to ignore those things than to deal with them. And turning to God, like, gives so much peace, but it also requires you to deal with these things. Like you were just saying,
Yeah.
like you can't just ignore these things. You have to take them to God, and that requires you to feel those things.
Again, yeah.
And that's not always like the most enjoyable, and it's not always the easiest. But then when you process those things and when you feel them, then the Lord will give you this peace and will give you this forgiveness and this joy, and he'll help you move past that. Versus there's this temptation to just do something that numbs you or turn to other things. And it's like, I'll just ignore this so that I don't have to feel the pain of that.
Yeah. That's funny. Because I mean, even like a psychiatrist, like a counselor will tell you the same thing. Like that someone has to confront something in order to get through it. Otherwise it continues to haunt them. Like someone doesn't stop having like terrorizing dreams from PTSD until they can come and examine that experience. And that God would design us that way, or that sin would have that effect on our minds, but ultimately can be used like to glorify him as we work through it, is super interesting to me. But that is as far as my like professional on that goes.
That is cool. Yeah. I just kind of I like that Paul is almost making himself like an unknown, like an unnamed person for this set amount of time, Like in verse 23, he says, they only were hearing it said, he used to persecute us and now is preaching the faith that he once destroyed. And so I think it's really cool that his identity is in that he is preaching the gospel.
Like he doesn't name himself in that.
He doesn't put, they only were hearing it said, Paul, who is a Pharisee, of like high prestige, who is very powerful, who persecuted us, is now preaching the faith that he once sought to destroy.
Yeah.
I like that he's really taking himself, he's removing himself, and he's completely identifying himself as, I was broken, Jesus healed me, and because of that, now I'm sharing what he's done in my life.
Yeah.
I just think that's really cool. And then he says, and they glorified God because of me.
Yeah.
I just like that. I think Paul's just a super humble guy, and he's not afraid of he knows his testimony is powerful. Yeah. And that's not because of him, but that's because of how Jesus worked in his life. And I just think it's something that we shouldn't be afraid of either, is understanding the true power that our testimonies hold in our own life.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think something, I don't even know why this came to mind, but while you were talking about that, something that like came to mind is the forgiveness or like the understanding that Peter had to have, because Peter was the first person that Paul went to.
Yeah.
And this dude killed one of his friends, and he came and now he's claiming to have changed. And Peter doesn't reject him. He stays with him. And that's something that's super cool. Like, obviously, he had the Holy Spirit allowing him to forgive and to encourage and to move past those things and see not Paul for Saul, like not Paul for what he's done, but Paul for what the Lord's done.
Yeah.
It's like if Osama bin Laden came to Christ,
Yeah.
we'd just be like, oh man.
Well, yeah, because there's Jeffrey Dahmer. Jeffrey Dahmer became a Christian in prison before he died. And like there's people who are always like so skeptical of, and it's like, you want to, yes, don't just accept anyone saying anything about Jesus, but don't be pushing people away because of their past. because you ultimately, I guess it can show like a lack of faith in like, oh, well, you know, like he was horrible. And it's like, well, you say God can change anyone, but you know, like actually extend that grace to people, which is so difficult. But like, especially in Peter's case, he literally killed one of his best friends.
Yeah.
That's forgiveness.
It's like Corey Ten Boom, if you've heard that
Yeah.
story.
Do you want to explain it
Well,
for people?
yeah, Corey Ten Boom was in a Nazi concentration camp with her sister, and they ran a little Bible study in one of the dorms. She's pretty famous for the story about like thanking God for the fleas, because the fleas that were in their beds kept the Nazi soldiers away. But ultimately, her sister is killed while she's in the camp, and she gets out and is giving her testimony in a church later in her life. And a Nazi soldier who, like, she had known and who had been specifically in charge of her, I think, like in charge of their dorm, basically came up and like offered his hand and asked for forgiveness and told her that he had found Christ. And she talks about like that she couldn't lift up her hand. Like she was trying, and she was just like, Lord, like help me to forgive him. And she says by God's power, like she lifted up her hand and shook it. She couldn't even say anything to him. But like in doing that, she took the weight off of him that Paul must have felt as well, right? Of what he had done. And Peter did that for Paul as well, like to take off. I mean, you just can't imagine like coming to know Jesus and then recognizing like you were just slaughtering people. I mean, that soldier was literally just watching people starve to death and doing nothing. But that forgiveness is such an amazingly powerful thing. So God gave her the strength to heal, to help him in his healing as well.
Which then is a huge testimony to outside people. Because like you see those clips of people in court, like parents in court.
Yeah.
And like there's a murder and he killed like multiple children. And they're all like cursing him, you know.
Yeah.
And then there's the one parent who's like I want to tell you about Jesus, and like I say I forgive you.
Yeah.
And then they give him a hug, and that's like, that is insane.
And those parents, I can move on in their life. Like those parents can look to God and say, like, thank you for your grace. Thank you for your sovereignty. Like, help us through this. And then they can move forward. Those other parents, I mean, they're going to be stuck in resentment for the rest of their life. It's going to eat them alive. That event is going to ruin, and it would, right? It would ruin anyone's life. Yeah. Like the loss of a child in that way would ruin anyone's life without Jesus.
But yeah, there's just so much power in the Lord's forgiveness to us, and then that really allows us experiencing that, then allows us to further forgive others. And there's just so much power in that, just like Corey Ten Boom story. And just like verse 24 says, and they glorified God because of me.
Bars.
To kind of bookend it there.
Yeah.
Anywho, that's it. Carter, thanks for coming on. It was
Thanks
fun.
for having me.
But with all that being said, thanks for watching, guys. Hope you enjoyed this episode with Carter. Let us know what you think about the basement setup, too.
Yeah.
See ya.
So, see you guys. Peace.